So, John, here we are in Brisbane. What brings you to Brisbane?
An irresistible invitation from a dear friend and colleague at the university here, Peter Little, currently serving as Deputy Vice Chancellor of the university. He and I had met in Brussels earlier this year in connection with what we call the 50+20 project, an initiative of the United Nations to draw up a new design for management education in the 21st century. And our friendship and our mutual interest just resulted in an invitation which I could not turn down. So absolutely delighted to be here.
So 50+20, whereabouts did that take place?
Well, the initial meetings took place roughly a year ago in New York City at the United Nations with a gathering of roughly 40 deans from business schools both in the States and in Europe and some farther afield to find out what our common sensibilities were around management education and the things which needed to change. The most important decision that was made early on was that we would not incrementally correct or adjust current models, but rather start from a blank slate of what the future requires of us. That proved to be, I think, quite a wise move. And at every step of the way, we were writing and constructing a model, in effect, drafting a book, which we took up periodically in subsequent meetings in St. Gallen, Switzerland, later on in Brussels, where I met Peter in the third round, and finally at the Earth Summit, where we delivered our message in perhaps a non-traditional way. Instead of a talking head or a report, we shared an 8-minute film, through which the message was voiced by multiple readers or speakers from around the globe.
What was the overarching change?
Well, there are several hallmark ideas, one of which is the interconnectivity of the world needs to be reflected in the interconnectivity of knowledge. So there's an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach to how people will be taught and how they would learn. Secondly, that management education needs to be leadership education. So we need to evoke the full potential of the individual, and along with that, to instill and encourage a sense of responsibility. So with the leadership comes responsibility. And also an appreciation of both the local and the global. And anyone in a leadership position needs to be sensitive and action-oriented in the local realm, but needs to be aware of what are the global issues with which we are all currently wrestling. And this agenda needs to be brought into the classroom, so to speak. And speaking of the classroom itself needs to be exploded, so it's not simply a room with 4 walls within an ivory tower, but rather the learning space of a community and the world. So these are among the hallmarks of the new approach.
So what's leading to these changes? What's making them necessary?
Well, higher education, since we're speaking at that level, has a couple of hundred years of tradition, which is compartmentalized knowledge and also secluded knowledge within the ivory tower concept, and particular departments. Often there's not a lot of permeability across departments. The world is not that way anymore, and a number of the leading universities, Stanford and Harvard, are now offering a great number of their courses for free on the internet. What do you think that does to the competition? The dissemination of knowledge as it can be packaged doesn't have to happen inside classrooms in the traditional spaces. That is available and can be made increasingly available for free to everyone. And the university therefore has to play a different role, more of a convener and an interpreter or a facilitator. A place and a space where the wrestling match of perspectives can play itself out, where the uncommon ground of sharing and deciphering and discernment and negotiation can be played out.
If that's what's going on in the educational realm, are we seeing those patterns go on in the broader community as well? Are there changes going on? What are the changes that are happening around the world that are precipitating that?
Well, I'm certain that the world is more and more made of these informal and constantly overlapping networks of ideas and learning and research discovery. We're all in collision with one another. And the collision is messy, and it's inherently messy. Nonetheless, there are institutions and networks which are giving soft structure to that whole process. And so we, who might be considered educators, need to build into the structure of what we would consider higher education, those softer structures and patterns, networks that we're seeing active in the wider world. We need to mirror it, in other words.
I'm really interested in the idea of facilitation. It seems that effective governments are providing a more facilitatory role in helping communities to make shifts as well. There seems that there is a role of artfulness in so many areas of leadership nowadays. What's the role of arts in the future of leadership and management?
Let's start with one of my favorite quotations by James Baldwin. He says, "The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers." And we are overwhelmed with tidal waves of answers that have blocked the kind of thinking in the moment, the impromptu, heartfelt, value-oriented associations with what we see in front of us. So we need to see what's behind all the answers that have been hurled at us and have been fixed in our minds and in the structures around us. And art plays this role. Art can be the mind opener, the heart opener, the catalyst for new imagery, the muscle which exercises imagination, thinking of things as if they could be otherwise, envisioning the not yet, and then helping to bring it into being, as Maxine Greene, our philosopher in the United States, speaks of so often, as the social imagination. Thinking of the not yet, and then working to bring it into being. This is the role of the artist, but ultimately it's the role of every human being. It's the role of educators, and very particularly also the role of leaders.
Your journey towards art and artfulness and entrepreneurship is a long one. Can you tell me where it began?
Oh Lord, trying to think where to jump into that story. Very early on, I found that I needed and absolutely adored the experience of being immersed in the ideas of science and the ideas, feelings, and inspirations of the arts. When I was a 12-year-old and couldn't possibly give voice to why I was doing what I was doing, I was a bright kid, and I was reading Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein when I was 12 years old. And a young fellow in the grade ahead of me approached me one day and said, "John, I have these records, these LP records, and I have to give them away because my mother says either they go or I go." And so I said, "Well, what are these things?" And it turned out to be Chopin's 24 Preludes and the other one, the Waltzes of Chopin, played by Alexander Bralowski, a phenomenal pianist. Now, I knew what a waltz was, but I had no idea what a prelude was. Hi there, Bertie. And so here was something mysterious, a prelude, that was also forbidden by his mother. So, oh, look at these guys. How lucky are we to have them visiting? Just amazing. What are they?
They are Indian miners. They are they're new arrivals to our country. They're not native, but they obviously like you.
Oh gosh, I like them too. Hi there. I don't know if you would want my fingers at lunch. Would you care for a nibble? So, you know, I took one of the records. I took the one of Preludes and brought it home to our little apartment. And when no one was around, I put it on the record player. And I heard when the stylus hit the vinyl. And then this eloquence of Chopin's Preludes filled the room, filled my imagination and my heart. And it was suddenly a language, an expression of my inner world as a 12-year-old, coming of age with emotions I knew nothing about, and aspirations and desires and yearnings, the loneliness, the sense of what perhaps love would be about. That I was surrounded by love by mom and dad, but you know, 12-year-olds are thinking beyond mom and dad at that point. And this was the voice of my inner life. And I played that record thousands, hundreds of thousands of times perhaps, driving my folks and my neighbors crazy. But I was, in retrospect, I was forming myself through that music. And one of my favorite experiences of all would be to read Einstein and play the Chopin at the same time. Now, again, I didn't know why I was doing this. All I knew was that I liked it. It was a high. And so years and decades later, it maybe is no surprise that all my life I have been weaving science and the arts together for the high perhaps that it delivers to me, but also because I've become a great believer in the need for overall coherence in knowledge. That the compartmentalization of knowledge served us for a time, but we are at a stage where synthesis and coherence is even more important. And so methods of pedagogy that underscore interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity to deal with the big hairy issues of our time are the ones which are more essential now. And so if artists and leaders can play the role of synthesizer, the agent of synthesis in a complex nest of issues where there are multiple perspectives and deep pockets of expertise which need to be reconciled with one another, brought civilly and imaginatively into juxtaposition, conversation, interaction with one another.
I know that Creative Leaps International is an organization that you're very proud of. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. When I was 22 years old, a young scientist also interested in the arts, I founded, along with a colleague of mine who was a young physicist, I was in biology and mathematics, he was in physics, we founded a nonprofit called Associated Solo Artists. Now, neither one were artists, neither of us, but it was an aspiration that someday we would grow into being artists. We were scientists and educators at the time, and the mission and purpose of the organization was to bring the arts and sciences into coherent, cross-fertile juxtaposition for the purposes of learning and sanity. Our own first, because that's what we were seeking, and also knowing deeply and intuitively that education in the schools, K through 12 and beyond, was also deeply compartmentalized, and it was not surprising to us that kids were falling out of love with the learning process because everything seemed disjointed and disconnected. Whereas if we are faced with an issue, loss of diversity of species, for example, we could approach an issue of that kind through literature, through being out in the beauty of nature, and through the sciences, then philosophy and art and so on. The great issues are made this way, and things were not being taught in the schools in that way. So we had the hope and aspiration that by creating an organization, ASA, Associated Solo Artists, premised on interdisciplinarity and the arts as a catalyst and opening up the mind and heart to new possibilities, new motivations, that might be a good starting point. And we are now in our 40th year, and Associated Solo Artist has manifested itself these days into 3 program divisions. One which offers concerts for the public of just music that everyone loves, including us, most especially, but something called the Learning Arts, which is dedicated in its entirety to K through 12 education, interdisciplinary approaches to teaching and learning, and arts experiences to deepen those skills and sensitivities in young people. Creative Leaps International, the one you made reference to, popped into existence in our 20th year when our methodology was invited into the business sector by a stroke of luck that brought us before a group called Human Issues in Management, vice presidents, presidents, and HR people from New York's multinational corporations. And the idea of the person who extended the invitation was, gosh, you guys are really good at helping to open up conversation and have people be more revealing and forthcoming with regard to their inner motivations and their inner lives. So, some smoke.
Oh, yeah.
Roasting of some kind of a nut. Well, I'm a nut as well, so maybe it's appropriate. So we were invited into this corporate setting to serve as a catalyst for the conversation around leadership, and it proved to be immediately successful. Our genre of performance presentation is called a concert of ideas. It's a vivacious concert performance by my colleagues and I, all of whom are now successful and well-trained performing artist facilitators, sharing music and stories in a way which does not deliver packaged answers, but provides the kind of provocative language and metaphor, the unfolding of stories and trajectories of thinking, to make the process of thinking unstoppable and irresistible. So we utilize that methodology in the business sector for that first occasion, and it precipitated an explosion of interest in what we were doing. We were the first arts organization in the U.S., to our knowledge, to ever do something like this. Now there are many who do versions of what we do, and this is wonderful because it means the idea is spreading. And no one out there is particularly copying Creative Leaps International, but the idea is in the wind. So dance companies and acting companies and visual artists and others are utilizing their art forms to get inside of people and to connect them with the big issues, to be more holistic in the way we think and learn. So that's the way Creative Leaps was born. And the name came out of my own little thought that we needed to separately brand our work in the professional sector from the work we did with little kids. I didn't think the corporate execs would think that a group that works with 7- and 8-year-olds and teenagers was necessarily the group that would work for them. So we have an appropriately corporate type name, professional sector name, Creative Leaps International, and these last 21 years have brought us to dozens and dozens of the major corporations in the U.S. and elsewhere in Europe, in Mexico, and amazingly here in Brisbane, where there's a tremendous interest in bringing us down for some more extended work in the course of this next year. Well, at this point, it's fair to say that Peter Little and others at the university, but most particularly Peter, I know him best, is possessed of a vision for the continued growth and essential change necessary in higher education everywhere, but particularly here in Queensland and in Brisbane. And he has done a marvelous job bringing the business school into the 21st century with strong components of digital education. And he has been empowered now in his new role as Deputy Vice Chancellor to look at the broader picture of the university as a whole and to see what might be done there as well. So with that in mind, and having met Peter in Brussels, as I mentioned earlier, he said, "Come on down, John, let's have some conversations with colleagues here to see what the chemistry might be like between what you do and with Creative Leaps International and the exciting trajectories that are already in progress and in motion here at the university." And so that's what this week has been all about, some wonderfully fertile conversations. There is no formal agreement with us yet, but there are things on the drawing board expressing our intentions. And so the hope is that we will find ways to bring my colleagues down here to serve as facilitator catalysts for the kinds of conversations which would allow the processes here to accelerate.
Ask a question about the arts in Australia and across the Western world seem to have been going through a bit of a crisis in the way that the arts have been delivered, and we're looking at a kind of a new version of the arts, similar to education. Can you speak about the role of arts and entrepreneurship in the future?
Oh gosh, well, you know, the most successful entrepreneurs are inspired by a vision and intuition, for which they have been able to engage action in spite of risk. That's often the context in which artists who are trying to do new things also work. And so there is a kinship in terms of attitudes and vision between entrepreneurs and artists. And these days, in many of the business schools and in some of the international projects with which we are affiliated with our U.S. State Department in North Africa, for example, the magic sauce that the North Africans are seeking is this spirit of entrepreneurship. And inside the spirit of entrepreneurship is a creative infrastructure and the sensibility that emerges from the arts. So it's not merely the businesses that emerge from arts and culture which become important to the so-called creative industries. The mindsets and sensibilities, the habits of mind, which are inherent to artists, that need to be underscored and empowered, more completely developed, appreciated more formally for what they are, and the value they have even beyond the art sector, but for all of us, entrepreneurs most certainly, but for all human beings. Through the spokespersons that we have working globally now, in terms of both Eric Booth and Ken Robinson, for example, and many others, we are underscoring that creativity lives within everyone and has a place for us in our everyday lives, in the most mundane ways, and also in dealing with the great challenges of our planet Earth at this time. If creativity moves to the center, moves center stage, then we are talking about art not as something which lives in galleries, but something that lives within us. And the terminology that I'm very fond of is that the work of art, the inner work that we do to produce art, or to think artfully under any circumstances, this inner work of art is actually, excuse the play on words, the formation of ourselves. We're creating the self. The inner work of art is the self. And it is the type of inner work that we do as we play and engage with art, which is the kind of thinking which shapes the development of leaders, of children, of human beings more broadly.
Thank you so much for chatting.
Great to be with you. Thank you, Paul.
I'm talking for longer, and my heart is getting warmer, and love is getting closer, and time is growing shorter.